Let's get right into it. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack one of the most intense, high-stakes corporate survival stories in all of tech history. We're talking about a conflict that literally changed the modern CPU market forever. I mean, if you think today's tech rivalries are fierce, the microprocessor industry back in the late 80s and early 90s was an absolute battlefield. It was an era defined by legal warfare, massive corporate tension, and a literal fight for sheer survival.
So, what happens when the tech giant you rely on for your very survival suddenly cuts you off? It's a terrifying scenario, right? Well, that is the exact David versus Goliath reality that set the stage for Advanced Micro Devices, or AMD. For years, they played a very specific role in the tech ecosystem, and then, almost overnight, they were pushed to the absolute brink of destruction.
Part 1. The IBM Supplier Shakeup. To understand how we actually got there, we've got to go back to the mid-1980s. At the time, the computing landscape was utterly dominated by one single name, IBM. They were an absolute powerhouse, but they had a very specific policy to protect themselves. They required what was called a second source manufacturer. Basically, IBM flat out refused to be dependent on just a single supplier for their critical PC components. So, as part of this strategy, IBM expected AMD to supply processors, specifically chips like the 8286 and the 8386, right alongside the original designer, which was Intel. It was a well-established ecosystem. AMD had an agreement, and they had a really clear role to play.
But as you can probably guess, there was a massive collision of interests looming. Intel started to realize just how incredibly important the x86 architecture was becoming. So instead of playing along with the shared ecosystem, Intel decided to tighten its grip. Their ultimate goal? To completely eliminate AMD as a competitor and secure exclusive dominance over the x86 processor market. So Intel did the unthinkable at the time. They refused to share the microcode for the 386 processor with AMD. They effectively broke the spirit of their earlier agreements. And for AMD, this wasn't just losing a contract. This was a massive existential threat. They were suddenly staring right into the abyss.
Part 2. Reverse engineering the AM386. Facing total collapse, AMD didn't just fold. But to really grasp their next move, we need to understand what Intel actually withheld. What exactly is microcode? Well, it isn't just some optional accessory. It's the fundamental, low-level instructions that are absolutely crucial for a processor's functionality. Think of it as the actual brain of the chip. Without this essential technology shared by Intel, AMD was entirely paralyzed. They had to find another way to build a compatible chip, and the only path forward was incredibly risky.
Instead of throwing in the towel, AMD executed one of the boldest maneuvers in semiconductor history. In 1991, completely cut off from the blueprints, AMD's engineers took a massive gamble. They successfully reverse-engineered Intel's microcode entirely on their own. It was a Herculean engineering feat that allowed them to develop their own compatible processor, the AM386. They essentially proved they could figure out the magic behind the curtain, keeping themselves alive in the market. But as you might expect, Intel wasn't just going to sit back and watch that happen.
Part 3. The 5-year legal war.
Intel responded swiftly to the AM386 with a brutal, highly complex intellectual property lawsuit, and this ignited what would become one of the most grueling court conflicts in all of semiconductor history. This wasn't just some quick injunction. We're looking at a timeline that goes from the broken agreements around 1986 to the bold launch in 1991, all while a prolonged legal battle was stretching out over 5 long years. The case escalated through multiple courts, draining resources and ratcheting up the tension until it finally reached the California Supreme Court in 1992.
And in 1992, the California Supreme Court delivered a major victory, ruling entirely in AMD's favor. They were officially granted the legal right to use Intel's x86 microcode under the terms of those earlier agreements. This was a massive turning point. It meant AMD could actually continue producing x86-compatible processors, and perhaps even more importantly for the entire industry, it ensured that real market competition was going to survive.
Part 4. The devastating 1994 defeat.
Now, you'd think the story ended there with a victorious parade, right? Well, not quite. In 1994, Intel launched yet another lawsuit, this time targeting the newer 8486 processor. And unlike the earlier case, AMD did not prevail here. This was a brutal, devastating defeat. The loss meant AMD was permanently cut off. They could never again rely on Intel's designs or microcode for any future processors. The message delivered by the court was absolutely clear. The safety net was gone. If AMD wanted to survive in the future,
It was going to have to innovate completely independently.
Part 5. Reinvention through Next Gen.
This defeat forced AMD into a critical challenge. How on earth do you rebuild your entire strategy without access to the very x86 designs that sustained you for years? Well, completely cut off from Intel's technology, they made a brilliant pivot in 1996 by acquiring a small but highly promising startup called NextGen. NextGen was a real game changer because they brought in a team of exceptionally talented engineers with a totally fresh approach to processor design. Instead of relying on Intel's architecture, NextGen's tech provided the foundation for a fully independent design philosophy. And the direct result of this acquisition was the launch of the completely independent K6 processor in 1997.
The K6 was an absolute lifesaver for the company. It didn't just function, it delivered really strong market performance and was offered at a significantly lower price than competing Intel chips, which of course was a massive win for consumers. This combination helped AMD immediately regain its critical market competitiveness. It proved once and for all that AMD could stand on its own 2 feet, and it solidified its future as a lasting global competitor in the semiconductor industry. Part 6. A Crucible of Independence.
This entire period, from 1986 through the mid-1990s, was so much more than just a series of courtroom battles. Through legal victories, painful losses, and absolute strategic reinvention, AMD transformed from a dependent, second-source manufacturer into a company forced to stand completely on its own. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Would AMD be the giant innovator it is today if Intel hadn't forced them into that crucible of independence? This era literally laid the vital groundwork for all their future innovations. Because sometimes, being pushed to the very brink of destruction is exactly what breeds the greatest competition. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning how the tech world around you really got built.